And thank you for coming to this talk today. So my name is Miriam Quick, and with me here today is Duncan Gear. And we have founded a creative studio called Loud Numbers. And today we're going to talk about data sonification, which is the practice of turning data into sound. So just as data can be visualized, so you can turn it into bars, you can turn it into lines, you can turn it into colors, it can also be sonified, which means turning the same data into pictures, volume levels, audio effects, and much more. So with sonification, you can tell stories with sound, you can add audio to visualizations, and you can even create pieces of music that are all driven by data. So we very much hope that by the end of our talk today, you will be convinced that sonification is a potentially powerful technique that's worth exploring further. Here's a bit about me, first of all. So I am a data journalist. I write data stories for the BBC and other publications. I work on a lot of data viz pieces for clients with creative agencies. And I'm particularly interested in unusual ways of working with data. So I create a lot of data artworks, often in collaboration with other people. And I'm also a musician. And I really enjoy working across different media. So I've turned data into everything from charts and graphics and books to necklaces and engraved 12-inch records, and of course, sonifications.
My name is Duncan Gear. Hello, thank you for having us today. I am an information designer. As you can probably tell, I am British, but I live in Sweden, in the south of Sweden. And I mostly do data viz and storytelling work with kind of climate and environmental non-profit clients, including the British climate charity Possible, Stockholm Resilience Centre, Project Drawdown, Conservation International. And I've also got a background as a journalist originally, which included collaborations with Information is Beautiful and the BBC and Wired magazine and a ton of other publications. And Miriam, who is the brains of our operation, has a degree in music, but I have no formal musical training whatsoever. But what I have done is I've kind of spent a huge chunk of my life listening to and making music. And I really love exploring new ways of representing data. And so it was kind of only natural that I would start connecting data with my love of music.
So at the end of 2019, which was, as you will remember, just before the pandemic, Duncan approached me with the idea of making a data sonification podcast. And we came up with a few terrible name ideas initially. We included data tune and sonority. And eventually we decided to call it Loud Numbers. And after working on it bit by bit around our various client projects, we released the first season in the middle of 2021. Each episode follows a similar format. First, we introduce a data story. Then we map parameters to various sounds, and I'll explain what that means in a second. And finally, we play a piece of music that we've made from those sounds. And we're pretty proud of it because we don't think anyone has actually done anything quite like it before. So there are 5 episodes in our podcast, and each one has its own music track. And with this, we wanted to explore a range of different musical styles and genres. So everything from techno and jungle right through to classical music. So this is the first episode. It's called The Natural Lottery, pun intended. So here we take data from an Alaskan sweepstake where people in a town called Nenana place bets on when the ice on their river will melt each year. And they've actually been doing this for more than a century. And we turned their data, their records, into a techno track. So the higher the pitch of the chords that you hear in the music, the earlier the ice on that river melted that year. So as climate change kicks in, the chords get higher and higher.
1933.
And here's another episode from the podcast. It's called Boom and Bust. And in this one, we use data on the US economy since 1968 to dictate the drum pattern in a jungle track. So when the economy grew, which was most of the time, the drums play forwards like normal. But when it was in recession, we actually reverse the sample so it plays backwards. And there's another sample when it starts to do this that says cool down the dance hall when the economy starts to cool down. So this one might be a little loud. that gives you a little bit of a flavour of the podcast. Since it was released, we've launched Loud Numbers as a full-on sonification studio and completed a bunch of commercial projects.
I love that jungle sonification. It's so silly. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about what sonification actually is. We've already established that it's basically the practice of turning data into sound, and we've just played you some examples from our podcast. But let's listen to a few examples of some other sonifications made by other people and break them down a little bit in terms of what is actually happening with them. Well, we'll start with a podcast from The Economist, which uses sonification to dramatize data around gender inequality. Having children has no effect on a man's wages, but women's average wages plummet after they give birth, and they don't really ever recover completely. This is called the motherhood penalty. And The Economist did a fantastic podcast on this, representing the motherhood penalty as a piano melody whose pitches plummet just like the data does. Let's have a listen to that.
This node represents the average salary of a Swedish father-to-be 1 year before having a child. Each following lower node represents a drop of 1%. After 5 years, the average father's salary has gone back up to its pre-child level and beyond.
And so what about Swedish mothers? How does the motherhood penalty look for them?
So in Sweden, after 10 years, a mother's salary goes from here to here. That's a drop of 27%.
Which sounds like a lot. I mean, how does that compare to other countries that might have different policies?
Well, British mothers earn 44% less than before they had a child. And mothers in my home country, Germany, are the most affected.
Wow, so Germany really hits some low notes. Marie, thanks very much for sounding this out with us.
Thank you, Jason.
It's so powerful, that, isn't it? Like, you really just like feel that last note. So yeah, another really nice example is this one, which is from Egypt building collapses by Tactical Tech. While The Economist mapped data to musical pitch, so when the data values go up, the pitch goes up, or down in that case, this one takes a slightly different approach. It's much more literal. It's a sonification of residential building collapses in Egypt. And every time a building collapses, you hear the sound of a collapsing building. And that's all. That's all the sonification does, is compress the timescale. So every second of sound represents 2 days in reality. But the emotional impact of actually hearing a building collapse is huge. Can we play that one, please, Miriam? Really drives the effect home really well. And as well, like in visualization, you can map more than one set of data at once to create different layers of sound. This is a project that I worked on called London Under the Microscope, with art direction from Valentina De Filippo and Arpad Ray. And we made it for the Museum of London, and it sonifies and visualizes sort of London's experience of COVID over the first 365 days, which play out over 365 seconds. So the way that this one works is that the louder and the harsher the drone sounds that you hear, the more cases and deaths associated with COVID, and different variants of the virus are represented as different notes, which kind of creates this shifting, unsettling chord throughout. And there's a baseline in the background as well that represents movement data with slower notes indicating fewer people using public transport. There are a few other layers as well, but we'll stick with that for the first time you hear this.
So you can even create music tracks with sonification techniques. Here's a pretty different commission that I worked on last year called Bristol Burning, and it turns air quality data from the city of Bristol into a dub track. So I'm going to play you first bit of it so you get a sense of it.
August.
Where do you go for your fresh air? And is there disparity? Let's compare. Oh, yeah. Who will speak up now? Who will dare? I'm not making it up when level peaks alarm waking them up. Wake up, something's coming. My city's on fire.
Just pause it there. So I don't know how much you can hear, because sometimes this doesn't come across very well on Zoom, but there's actually two layers to this track. So first of all, there's the music, which features the vocals from a really great hip hop artist that I work with, who's based in Bristol, called T Relly. And then there's also the sonification layer, which is actually a dirty sounding drone that's layered over the top of the music. You might have just been able to hear it coming in towards the end of that clip there. Now, this drone, it sonifies monthly average levels of air pollution from particulates in Bristol. So the pollution levels are actually mapped to the volume of the drone and also to the cutoff of a low pass filter on it, so that the louder and the harsher the drone sounds, the worse the air quality was that month. And it sounds kind of nasty, kind of dangerous, because air quality is nasty and dangerous. And it follows the course of a year. So it starts in one summer, finishes the next summer. And because air quality generally gets worse in winter, the drone starts off quite quietly and then it gets completely wild in the middle of the track. So I'm going to play a little extract just from the middle so you can get a sense of how it sounds when the air is bad.
I see the traffic in the morning, daytime, nighttime, yeah. Wood burners, all them things there. We're in a loop.
So again, it will depend on your video quality a little bit, but on my system, that's really kind of drowning out the track, just like air pollution kind of drowns out people's lives and gets in the way. So the examples that you've heard from us so far are quite complex ones, but a lot of sonifications are actually loads simpler. Actually, sonification has been around for at least a century and in much more everyday forms. And these are forms that you wouldn't normally think of as sonification. And they include things like the Geiger counter. So hopefully you won't get to hear them doing that, but if it does, radiation is nearby. Or the ECG. Or even the phone ringtone. Still annoying. Burglar alarms, checkout beeps, the ding that tells you the car seatbelt isn't fastened, those sounds that tell you that a vehicle is reversing, they're all sonifications. They're all things that alert you to an important change in state, which sonification is really good at. Because a loud sound, unlike a flashing light, for example, is really, really hard to ignore, and it will reach you even if you happen to be looking in the wrong direction. So there's actually a whole broad landscape of sonifications out there. And in 2002, a sonification researcher called Thomas Herman proposed 5 different categories of sonification, which we've simplified down into 3 here. First, you've got audification. This is when you get a bunch of data and you speed it up or you slow it down to get it into a range that can be heard by the human ear. And one example might be this one I'm about to play, which is called Sounds of the Sun. And it was published in 2018 by NASA using data gathered by its solar and heliospheric observatory on low frequency sound waves bouncing around inside the sun. So they took this wave data and they simply sped it up by 42,000 times to bring it into the range of human hearing. And it sounds like this. Not the most exciting, but it is quite interesting when you know what it is, that you know that this is the sound of the sun. Then you've got ear cons and auditory icons. So these are short little audio clips that represent events. So these are ringtones, other phone notifications, Geiger counters that I just played that represent radiation levels, or the blips of a barcode scanner. And in Herman's explanation, ear cons are just abstract pings and bloops, while auditory icons sound like the thing that they represent. So this can be a very simple but very effective way to represent data. And then finally, we've got parameter mapping, which is what most people in data visualization will think of when they hear the word sonification. So this is where you map data values onto different audio parameters or dimensions, like pitch, just as data viz maps data values onto visual properties like color, shape, size, angle, and so on. Parameter mapping is the most common approach to sonifying data, and this is the one that we've taken with loud numbers as well. You can put these 3 categories of sonification along a scale of abstraction, where audification is closest to the original data. It kind of is the original data, whereas parameter mapping is the most abstract because it involves the most processing to translate the data into sound.
But the biggest question of all is, why on earth would you want to do any of this stuff, especially when you've got access to visualization techniques? And so we're going to try and convince you. One reason is that sonification is particularly good, we think, for telling stories that have impact. Sonification could do a lot of things, but for us, a really important thing is that it's a super powerful communication tool. And breaking this down a little bit, we think that there's maybe like 5 key things that sonification delivers that can be super, super useful in any kind of data storytelling process. And the first one, as we've kind of experienced a few times in this presentation already, hopefully, is emotional impact. People have all kinds of emotional associations with music and sound, and these can be physical, they can be even visceral. Like sound can get so loud that it hurts, but you could never have a bar chart that gets so long that it hurts. And people feel a lot of apathy and disengagement towards many topics today, particularly the environment, but also things like social injustice, wealth inequality, things like that. And we think that new communication methods are really, really helpful to cut through, and that sonification is one way to help people engage more emotionally rather than just analytically with these kinds of data. And the second thing that sonification delivers is immersiveness. Sound is, as we've discussed, very immediate and sometimes intrusive. If you think of a noisy car alarm or a phone ringtone on a quiet train, it's hard to ignore them. It's very good at cutting through and alerting you to new information. But the other great thing that sound does is that you can use it to create a sense of place, take people to another world. And that place doesn't have to be a real soundscape, though it can be based on one. It can also just be the soundscape of the data itself. And because of this immersiveness, sonifications afford a very different experience of data than visualization does. We really love this quote from philosopher Donna Haraway about visual bias in the way that science usually imagines the world. She calls it the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere. And this is often applied to data viz, right? Because you have a chart in front of you and you get this quick overview of a data set. You see everything at once. It makes it really easy to think that you are in some way separate from what the data represents, and that your view of that data, and maybe even the data itself, is perfectly neutral and objective. And this is kind of a point of view that we, Miriam and I, are quite skeptical of. I think that, you know, striving for objectivity is absolutely an important thing to do in a lot of situations. But data is always gathered and represented and understood by humans, and humans have biases and faults and idiosyncrasies. And sonification doesn't give you that illusion of objectivity. Because you experience it in time, from moment to moment, from data point to data point, you get much closer to what the data is representing and the changes and the patterns within it. And that also means that you don't get that overview in the same way you do with a visualization. So we've had a go at rewriting this Donna Haraway quote for sonification. It offers you the human trick of hearing something from somewhere. That is, perceiving a limited amount of information from a single perspective. And if we're totally honest with ourselves, that's all that we can ever do. Now, a third big benefit of sonification is accessibility. Sonification broadens inclusion by bringing the magic of data storytelling to people who have visual impairments, or just people who aren't looking directly at the screen in any given moment. And a fourth benefit, which is related to that, is that sonification lets you make compelling data experiences in audio-only formats, like on radio or in podcasts. And finally, let's be honest, there's a novelty factor to sonification. It gets headlines just for being sonification sometimes. And this probably won't last forever, but for the time being, it can be pretty useful.
So those are the upsides of sonification, but does it have any downsides? Well, yes, it does. The first one is that you can't represent absolute values using sound. You can only represent relative changes from moment to moment. So in sonification, there's no equivalent to a chart labeled with the numbers that it represents, or an axis that starts at 0. The limits of your dataset range mark the limits of what you can sonify, and all changes will be perceived by your listeners relative to those range extremes. But on the flip side, this lack of absolute reference points makes short-term fluctuations feel more important, which is one reason why it's so immersive. Sonification can be quite imprecise, depending on the mappings that you choose. So while mappings like pitch are relatively precise, others like volume or effects are very broad brush, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. But for now, just know that if it's super critical that your data is communicated with a really high degree of precision, you might want to use a visualization instead. It challenges working memory because sound unfolds over time. To decode a sonification, you have to remember the mappings first. That's assuming that it's audio only. And you have to remember what the sounds mean. And then you have to hold that information in your head for the entire duration of the sonification. You've got to remember the highs, you've got to remember the lows, the peaks and the troughs, often for quite a long time, and then compare them to what you've heard most recently to get a sense of the relative magnitude of those recent changes relative to the whole range of the data set. Now, that can be quite a challenge. And for this reason, sonification often works best when it's actually paired with visuals. So for example, you can have an animation that plays at the same time and visualizes the same data. And finally, the flip side of novelty is, of course, unfamiliarity. So most people aren't used to decoding sonifications, not yet anyway. It's still quite niche. So this means that when you turn data into sounds, you typically have to explain to your audience not just the system that you've used for that data set, but often the entire concept of sonification. But, this could easily change. Like, nobody knew how to read a bar chart 500 years ago, but today it feels natural for many people. So we're hopeful that people can also learn to decode and to understand well-made sonifications and come to appreciate the value of the different perspective that they offer.
And hopefully it won't take 500 years.
Yeah.
But you might have noticed that almost all of the examples of the sonifications that we've played so far use data that's arranged over time. And that's because time series data is a supernatural fit for sonification. It might be quarterly economic growth or annual chocolate bar sales or decadal average temperatures. With a bit of cleaning and aggregation, it's probably going to sound okay if you sonify it. And the reason is that sound itself plays out over time. So there's a super direct relationship there. You're essentially compressing the duration of your data into the duration of your sonification. And that's why time series data is probably the easiest kind to start with, but it's not the only kind of data that can be sonified. A couple of years ago, I worked on this map for the climate change charity Possible with a developer called Karim Douaib, and it sonifies geographical data on noise pollution in London, Paris, and New York. And as you move the mouse over the map, you can hear what the noise pollution sounds like in a given location. It's quite fun to play with, and the sort of interactivity factor of being able to move your mouse around the map makes it quite a compelling experience. So now we know a bit about the upsides and downsides of sonification and what kind of data works best, but how do you go about actually making one? So this chart that we've made, it's a visualization, not a sonification, sorry, is kind of shows a bit of the landscape of tools that you can play with. On the left, you've got simple tools, and on the right, you have more complicated tools. And the tools at the top are the ones that require no coding skills, whereas the ones at the bottom need more and more advanced coding knowledge and experience to get good results. So in the bottom right, you have the complicated coding tools like Sonic Pi and Max MSP and Super Collider. And in the top left, you have some of the simplest ones like two-tone and CSV to MIDI. But you don't actually need any of that to do sonification. You can do really good sonification work with just a piece of paper and a pencil and nothing else. And we call this punk sonification. It's near the top in the no code section. It's basically about using your voice and the things around you, and it's very direct and immediate. And we give punk sonification workshops sometimes, so hit us up if you want to talk about that. All sonification tools basically do the same thing. They help you convert or map the data that you have to one or more parameters of sound in a kind of systematic way. And this is the parameter mapping that we talked about earlier. And deciding how to do that parameter mapping is a really important decision. And by parameters, we mean aspects or dimensions of sound. So I'd like to invite you all to type into the chat some parameters of sound that you could potentially map data to. So I'll give you a clue. We already talked about pitch, mapping things to pitch, but what are some others that you could perhaps think of? Type some into the chat. Volume's a good one. Yeah. Any other suggestions? Tempo is a really interesting one. Reverb, yeah. The sort of depth of a reverb. Key is a really, really interesting one because it kind of is different between different cultures. And that's, yeah, that can introduce some interesting things as well. I mean, yeah, if you're familiar with making charts, it can be quite useful to think about parameters in visual terms because sonification and visualization work in quite similar ways. And in 1967, French cartographer Jacques Bertin came up with the idea of visual variables, which he defined as position, size, shape, brightness, hue, orientation, and texture. You've possibly come across these before. And in a similar way, we've created our list of some of the parameters of sound that can be mapped to data, and we call them sonic variables. So this includes pitch and volume, type of sound. So that could be different instruments or different timbres of the same instrument. There's timing aspects like tempo, sound duration, rhythm, number of sounds in a time period. So like the density of sound. There's much more stuff you can do there. There's also pan, which is like the spatial position in the audio field, whether you hear left or right, or 5.1 surround and things like that. There's also like effects like filters and reverb and distortion, which some of you picked out in the comments. And all of these things can be used to encode and communicate data values. And again, just like in visualization, you can also double or triple encode things by using more than one of them at the same time.
So that's the whistle-stop tour of sonification. So we really hope that it's got you inspired by its potential. And if you are interested, here are some useful resources that might help you if you want to give it a go for yourself. So if you're looking for more examples of cool sonifications, there are literally hundreds in the Data Sonification archive, and that you can see at sonification.design. There's loads of inspiration there. I think there's something like 450 sonifications, so do have a look. For some tools, for beginners to sonification, we really recommend having a play with Data Sonifier, which was actually only released a few months ago. It's super easy to use, it doesn't involve any code at all, and you can map a data set to up to 6 different audio parameters, including filters and effects and rhythm. And if you speak German, it's also available in German as well as English.
Or you just want to practice.
Or you just want to practice your German, yeah. So if you're a musician, whether that's a pro musician or an amateur, and you're looking to experiment with something a little bit more powerful, then this is the Loud Numbers module, and it's for the Modular Synth Simulator VCV Rack, which you can download for free from vcvrack.com. So Duncan actually made this tool, which allows you to tap into VCV Rack's huge library of audio manipulation modules. You can use data to modify almost any aspect of the sound, depending on how the cables are connected up. So there's a bit of a learning curve here still, but it's much smaller than the requirement to learn how to code. And we actually gave a workshop in Amsterdam where we taught people how to use it in a single afternoon. So, you know, it can be done. I've learned it myself. And there's also lots of tutorials on YouTube that can help you get to grips with the basics of VCV Rack more generally. If you are into coding, or if you're up for learning a bit, you could try out Sonic Pi, which is another free program that uses the Ruby programming language. And you can download it, again, it's free, from sonicpi.net. It's actually pretty powerful, and the built-in tutorial materials are really, really good and really good easy for beginners to follow. So we actually made most of the sonifications for the Loud Numbers podcast using Sonic Pi. And if you're looking for a simple data set to make a quick sonification, maybe you just want to try it out, and you don't want to do lots and lots of data transformation work first, there are some sample data sets on the Loud Numbers GitHub page. They're all time series data, and they're all suitable if you're just starting out with sonification. So yeah, have a look, have a play around. There's also a load of other stuff on our GitHub page, including a guide to using the Loud Numbers VCV Rack module. So yeah, have a look around. We keep updating it.
So if you have enjoyed this talk and you are excited and you want to find out more and maybe talk to some people that are doing sonification, then we have a community that you can join. It's called Decibels. You can find it at decibels.community. And it's quite nice. It's like nice level of activity, a few posts a week. Everyone is super friendly and up for sharing their experiences. And my experience is that everybody who joins says that they don't feel qualified to be there. So if you don't feel qualified to be there, then you will be in very good company. You should definitely join. We sometimes run challenges. We do little workshops for the community. We have beginner resources and lots more. So yeah, you can join up, you can lurk a bit and just contribute whenever you want. And then finally, it would be remiss of us not to give a little plug to our studio, Loud Numbers. Miriam and I are always on the lookout for interesting new projects. So absolutely feel free to contact us if you'd like to chat and see if we can work together, or pass on our details to anyone else who might be interested. You can email us anytime you like at numbersloud@gmail.com, because someone already had loudnumbers@gmail.com. Honestly, why? We also do a irregular newsletter where we round up what we've been doing and what's been happening in the wider sonification community, and you can sign up for that on our website too, loudnumbers.net. So yeah, that's our talk. Thank you very much